But I don't know, there are times where I get the strong sense that God likes a good argument with me. I never win any of them, but let's see. You need that one, so I need to give you the. No, well. Hey, Brother Eric, one more microphone up here would be a good thing. Is that a doable? What? Okay, yeah, but we do have the other. We need one down there. I'm just, thinking out loud. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt the worship service. Our gospel reading this morning is from the 21st chapter of the Gospel of Luke, verses 1 through 9. As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich people putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. I tell you this, the truth, he said. This poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth and abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Now, some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, as for what we will see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. Teacher, they asked, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place? He replied, watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name claiming, I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
One of the things that is finally happening after a very long time in our nation is that it's just beginning to emerge as one of the many, many, many great policy debates in our country. It's the issue of income inequality. Fact of the matter is that for about the last 40 years, rich people have gotten richer, and poor people have gotten poorer, and at least part of that has been due to the economic policy of our government and the wonderful fun and games that they play over the issue. Now, while overall wealth in this nation has grown and grown greatly, who gets that wealth has largely been a case of the haves getting more and the have-nots getting less, at least in terms of the appropriate pieces of the economic pie. When I was in Chicago, the Chicago area a couple of weeks ago, I ran into a friend from high school at the airport following the wedding. We had both attended the wedding, and then we ran into each other at Midway. And since we each had a bit of time to spare before our respective flights were called, we sat down to chat and get caught up. After oohing and awing over the wedding, and particularly the party part of it, it was great. We ventured into other areas, and both of us managed to express our opinions over current economic policy that has created this wealth inequality, added to the wealth of the wealthy and added to the poverty of the poor. There's a fun talk that, of course, absolutely solved nothing. And the fact of the matter is, however, is that this conversation, once again, is long overdue in our nation. And this is probably more than you want to know. The primary culprit in the policy practice of this is something called supply-side economics. Supply-side economics, as contrasted with demand-side economics, which is really more than you want to know, is an economic theory that says that lower taxes and decreased regulation is the key to economic growth. As it comes out in policy, however, it's been responsible for growing wealth inequality, the huge burgeoning of federal deficits, and all sorts of other economic ills. Most economists, except for supply-side economists, think that supply-side economics is a fallacy. Now, our current situation is such that, as I said a few weeks ago, the top 10% of the population controls 76% of the world's wealth. 10% controls 76, which means that 90% gets the remaining 24%. $1 trillion has been added to the national debt in the last year. And another number of billionaires, not all I'm sure, have come forth with the request that the government tax them more. Warren Buffett, my fellow citizen of Omaha, put forth the year before last that his personal income tax rate was lower than his secretary's. And I asked the country why. And it just came out this last week that the average billionaire's tax rate is lower, for the first time in history, is lower than the average middle-class citizens. The conversation's still falling on a lot of deaf ears, but the conversation has become much more lively in the last 18 months. There was, stating, and it basically dates back to when the Tax Reform Act occurred. Now, probably the burning question in your minds is, are there any burning questions in your minds? Just thought I'd ask. Why is a preacher talking about economic policy on this fine Sunday morning? Well, one reason, of course, is that it's Stewardship Commitment Sunday, and where we make a commitment of time, talent, and resources to God's church for this next year. So money is an appropriate subject for the day. And like Brother Chris, I used to be very uncomfortable talking about it, but I don't have that problem anymore. Another, however, more pressing reason is that Christian ethics requires an occasional foray into the branch of money matters. Because as a human community, money runs a lot of what we do. And since money is a human subject and a human object, money also has its Christian ramifications and its impacts. Now, Jesus had a fair number of comments on the subject of finance. You can recall, I hope, the passage where he said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and render unto God the things that are God's." And then there's this passage for this morning in the 21st chapter of Luke, where Jesus talks both about offerings and about earthly splendor that will turn to dust. Now, Jesus and his disciples in this scene are sitting in the temple, part of the temple that's devoted to offerings. And he notices a couple of things. He notices that rich people coming up and putting their offerings in, and we don't know whether they were accompanied by brass bands or a choreographic sequence with dancers. I think it would have been fun to see that. But if we assume that Luke does with this story of wealth as he does with other circumstances in his gospel, you can almost assume that that's the context, is that there's some amount of fanfare when the wealthy come in to put their offerings. And then he notices a poor widow who just comes in and puts in 2 copper coins. That's less than a day's wage. And he tells the disciples, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. And they're all going, huh? Think about what the reaction would be. A person puts in a talent, or a person puts in 300 denarii, which was 300 days' wages, and then this widow comes in and puts in 2 copper coins. And Jesus says, she's put in more than all the rest. Why? Well, widows had no status in the Hebrew society unless they were part of a family unit. So if a widow is on her own, she's going to be living in great poverty. That's just the way it worked back then, and to some extent still now. And it could very well be the case that those 2 copper coins were all that she could have, all that she could give, all that she had for that particular day. Not even probably enough for a loaf of bread. Certainly more than she could reasonably afford if she's on her own. What the heck would motivate her to do such? What would cause that? Now, offerings, of course, are part of the traditions of most organized religions, which some people think is why they have a problem with most organized religions. I once visited a Hindu temple, and there were 9 stations for the various manifestations of the one true God in Hinduism. And Hinduism's primary practice is giving alms and giving prayers to all of those 9 manifestations, whichever one inclines you today. And it has to do with various aspects of personality and how it's all structured. And I got very confused about that and haven't had a chance to study it since. Judaism and Christianity talk about tithing. Islam promotes offerings as well, especially during pilgrimages. And in all cases, the offerings are tied to 2 things: giving thanks to God and helping the poor. Those are the 2 things: giving thanks to God and helping the poor. You might recall me talking a couple of months ago about how offerings are taken in the nation of the Congo, where in your average worship service in the Congo was 44 hours long. You'd lynch me, wouldn't you? And the taking of the offering was 45 minutes long. And how the offering, they had big offering pans up here in the front of the sanctuary. They had one on here for the men and one over here for the women because they sat on separate sides in worship. And then they had this central one that was for the poor. Now, the average salary in Congo is less than $400 a year. And yet these people with joy spent 45 minutes dancing up and down the aisles and gave offerings to the poor. In the Christian faith and in the stories of Jesus, the emphasis is on that sort of giving. It's sacrificial. Sacrificial giving and care for the poor. But somehow the emphasis on sacrifice in a lot of ways gets kind of lost among us. You see, the biblical standard here is the tithe, 10% of income. And you know that there are some churches around the country that require you to bring in your W-2 form from the year before so that they can tell what your tithes should be, and their tithes will set that. There are some churches that do that. What do you think? How do you think that'd work here? Oh, okay. But actually, in most churches affiliated with Protestantism, when we all talk about the biblical standard of the tithe, the actual level of giving among most families is somewhere around 2.5% to 3%. And that's true in this congregation as well, probably. I haven't checked your income statements lately. And that's kind of sad in some ways, but it also points just about how much we wrestle with things like this and how much we wrestle with our income. There are a lot of people who feel like they can't afford any more than that. But I would raise the question, is it a matter of affordability or is it a matter of trust? I love what Chris had to say, that we try to be transparent and we try to, but that every dollar goes here to a good cause. You might be a little about the pastor's salary, but other than that, everything goes to a good cause. If we're truly thankful to God, then that's a matter of fully trusting God for all that God gives to us. And if we're unable to trust in God, then that also affects our giving and our stewardship, which is one of the religious practices. You see, there's a bit of a paradox in human behavior in this, as well as in a lot of other things, I guess. But what I want to encourage you to think about this morning, besides the story of the widow and her sacrifice, is your joy quotient. Your joy quotient. Is your life with God a joyful one? And if it is, then the Thanksgiving factor ought to be a pretty good one. And your giving should be linked in with that. There used to be a saying in stewardship circles, give until it hurts. I don't think that that's an effective measure of giving because so many of us have such low thresholds of pain. I think a better measure of that is give until it's past hurting and starts feeling good again. My guess is that was what the widow in our story for this morning was reflecting and going for and experiencing. She was giving until it was past hurting and started feeling good again. She lifted up her heart and gave because she was joyful and thankful for her life, even amidst the struggles she was having with it. That's why Jesus pointed her out over all the rich folks, giving more substantial monetary gifts because of her joy. Now, as we move forward making our statements of commitment in time and talents and resources for the year 2020, I'd like you to think and pray about how blessed you are and how joyful the opportunities for joy are available in your life, and give accordingly. And like I have the last couple of years, I want to state personally that my pledge for 2020 will be a little bit over 4% higher than it was in 2019. Just for the record. Maybe that could serve as a bit of a guide of sorts, unless your giving is way below the tithe. And by the way, I have found over my lifetime that in the years I practiced the tithe, life is more engaging, more lively, more joyful, and more fulfilling than those times when I'm a scaredy cat and pull back. Isn't that interesting? There is something in the connection between tithing and joyfulness. I'm sure that's why God put the tithe in place. So however things are for us economically, whether we're rich or poor, billionaires or street people, the focus for God is not on what we have, but what we give and the joy that comes from that giving. That's what defines us spiritually as children of God. The generosity of spirit, the willingness to care, the joy that comes from being such children. In the name of God the Creator, God the Savior, and God the Spirit, amen.